what I'm going to be referencing here is an article that you can find on the internet. It seems like it was taken from a sermon, and it's called "Does Paul Condemn Observing God's Holy Days?" It was made by a man named Earl L. Henn, Henn. And you can find, well, you should be able to find this by Googling Paul NT, as in New Testament, the initials NT, holidays, and it should be the first article that pops up. I want you to read that as I'm reading it, so that while I'm breaking it apart, you can see how, as the topic here says, how false teachers counterfeit systematic exegesis. How do they make it look like they're reading the text in this sophisticated fashion that's superior to the way that those who they are preaching against is reading the text? Okay? Because that the appearance of a systematic exegesis works to give you the perspective that their position is true. It seems like they're giving you a context that nobody knew about when they're missing the context that's actually present in the text. I want to show you. I want to break this down, okay? So the article starts off like this. He says, through the centuries, theologians have devised many arguments to do away with the observance of God's holy days. They propose that various scriptures in the New Testament obviate the need for Christians to keep the days which God's law specifically says are holy to him. And he references there Leviticus 23:2. He says a favorite target of theirs is Galatians 4, verses 9 and 10, in which Paul expresses his frustration with the Galatians because they had returned to certain religious practices. This right here is already something that he's assuming that you're going to see why this assumption is wrong, but that assumption, his position hinges on that assumption being true. So I want to tell you that, later on, I'm going to address this claim that they return to certain religious practices. Okay? He calls these practices weak and beggarly elements and says they were in bondage to them. Now, the first thing that I want to point out, and you will notice this in a lot of false teachers, even those who claim to be orthodox, okay, who are in appearance orthodox, their teachings have a lot of they, them. It's a lot of anti, and not a lot of pro. And then it hinges on the anti, even when it seems to be pro. It's going to shame this over here to then bring in the back door what is being proposed, but what is being proposed is supported on the basis of the anti. The problem with that kind of teaching, and you never see, I want to point out on my account, you do not see me teach like that, and there's a reason for this. You got to think, if you're selling somebody a product, if you want to sell me a car and cars are better than walking, you should never have to say anything anti-walking. You should be able to talk about the car. The only thing that you should have to say in regards to walking is that driving is this many times better. Like switching to Geico can save you 15% or more on car insurance. If Geico's advertisements is talking about they and them and that, as opposed to going 15% or more on car insurance, and then in telling you why Geico is better, then there's some kind of flaw in Geico that Geico wants to distract you from by getting you to shame and attack, let's say, Allstate. If Geico doesn't save you 15% or more on car insurance, it has to spend too much time attacking over here because it doesn't have anything to offer. But if it has something to offer, then it can talk about itself and then close that out by saying 15% or more on car insurance. So anybody that has the truth is going to be talking about the truth. The Bible doesn't talk about the Satan that much. The Bible spends most of its time talking about Yahweh. It spends most of the time talking about the new creation. It's telling you it because the truth has no deficit. Okay? But on the other hand, the wicked are always anti the Bible. Anti. They spend much more time being anti the Bible than the Bible spends being anti-paganism. Even though the Bible is anti-paganism, the primary way that it's preaching against paganism is preaching to you the truth. That's because the truth gives life. Okay? The truth is not a vampire. The truth gives life. So if I have the truth, I'm telling you about the truth. I'm not spending all this time talking about they. Fact of the matter is, you already know they suck because your life sucks, and you're still looking for something that's better than what you got. You don't have the truth, so you already know that. Okay. So that's the first thing I want to say that it rubbed me wrong about this is all this they, a favorite target of theirs is Galatians, but this like the crux of their that's not how you teach if you have the truth. That's how you teach if you're trying to introduce something that has no merit and there's no way for you to support it on its own. So let's go back through the rest of the article. He says in verse 10, he defines these practices as observance of days and months and seasons and years. The argument begins at this point because some contend that these observances refer to God's holy days commanded in the Old Testament. Indeed, God established specific days, Passover, days of unleavened bread, Pentecost, etc., months, new moon, sacred calendar, seasons, appointed times, and then he goes on here to quote the different verses that have appointed times and years, and then he quotes verses that talks about the Jubilee and sabbatical years. He says the traditional mainstream Protestant explanation of Galatians 4:9-2 is that Paul is reprimanding the Galatians for returning to Old Testament observances that were a form of bondage, insisting that Paul taught that the Old Testament law was done away. Insisting that Paul taught that the Old Testament law was done away, they conclude that Christians should not keep the days that God commanded Israel to keep. Is this what Paul was telling the Galatians? Does the message of the letter in the context of his statements confirm this to be the correct explanation? Notice these questions. This is another tactic that I see so often. If not, what were these weak and beggarly elements that Paul warns them about? Let's examine these verses and understand what Paul really says in this highly disputed section of Scripture. These questions are trying to open you up to like, it's sort of an inquiry type that's meant to turn you away from logic to hypothetical. Now I'm gonna show you this in very quick because he says there's a title, Galatia and Gnosticism. Whenever you see anybody opening up talking about Gnosticism, you can pretty much know that they're wrong because Gnosticism is like a big boogeyman. And it's like a remnant of old times. um, when folks didn't really recognize the conflict that Peter was having with these groups within the first generation church that were trying to Judaize things. So in Acts, when you see the Jerusalem Council, for example, that was such a conflict that was occurring between the apostles about the observance of the law. When you see Peter have that vision in Acts where Yeshua has to tell him that, you know, you shouldn't be rejecting the Gentiles. That's because he was at that time trapped heavily in the Jewish culture that he was supposed to have broken away from. And the compromise of the Jerusalem Council is also a product of that. For a long time, folks didn't understand this conflict, and so they were attributing a lot of the stuff that Paul was talking about to Gnosticism. But we now know that what he was confronting was folks who were trying to push the old covenant. And so Gnosticism is a boogeyman that is like an anachronism from a time where folks couldn't recognize what was going on in this tension between the apostles themselves, okay? Or between the Orthodox community within the churches. And so he says, whenever we are studying scriptures that are difficult to understand, we must consider the cultural and historical context, okay? So now he's saying that he's going to tell you what the context of all this stuff is. Not just in the text, but also cultural and historical. Okay? What I'm going to show you is how this counterfeit of contextual reading can happen even when the plain text is being read. Even when the reader isn't hiding anything about what the plain text is saying. I want to show you how a narrative that's claiming to be context can interfere with what the text is saying within your biochemistry as a reader. So he claims that he's going to give you cultural and historical context, and then he says in the next sentence, Galatia was not a city, but a province in Asia Minor. The church membership was undoubtedly composed mainly of Gentiles, and the males were physically uncircumcised. In looking at Paul's initial dealings with these people, we find that they had a history of worshiping pagan deities. In Lystra, God healed the crippled man through Paul. The people of the area were so astonished at this miracle that they supposed Barnabas and Paul, whom they called Zeus and Hermes, to be pagan gods. They wanted to sacrifice to them, and would have if the apostles had not stopped them. This shows that the people in Galatia were generally superstitious and worshipped pagan gods. Okay? The first thing that came into my mind as I was reading this is I said, okay, he's claiming that this is paganism, specifically Gnosticism. And as he's giving you all this cultural and historical context, it can sound good what he's saying. But who does Paul say that he's speaking against? That's the context that we need, that tells us what everything in Galatians is about. Does Paul say that he's speaking against pagans, or does Paul say that he's speaking against those who are trying to push the old covenant? If you read Galatians, and particularly it starts up at chapter 2, and you go from chapter 2 to chapter 3, you see that who Paul is speaking against is a group of men who came from the Apostle James. He called them the circumcision group. And they were pushing justification through the old covenant. They were teaching that you had to follow the old covenant in order to be righteous and or to be saved. And these were men who were sent by the Apostle James. So this is not a pagan group. Okay? When these men came to Peter, and Peter started this is in Galatians chapter 2. When they came to Peter, and Peter started to turn against the Gentiles, Paul says to Peter, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? He don't say nothing about paganism. So this is not about paganism. This is not about Gnosticism. Furthermore, you can confirm this when you go into chapter 4 of Galatians. And this is something I'm going to reference again. But in chapter 4 of Galatians, Paul talks about Sarah and Hagar and how they allegorized the two covenants. And he says Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. Okay. The covenant on Mount Sinai is the old covenant. What does that have to do with paganism? Paul is telling you who he's speaking against. He's speaking against folks who are pushing the old covenant. This is the covenant that came down from Mount Sinai. Nowhere does he say paganism. There's one part in chapter 4 that you can misinterpret as paganism, and this guy actually mentions that, but I'm going to explain how that's being misinterpreted. Okay? When I get to that point. But the big point here is, who does Paul say that he's speaking against? And Paul is saying that he's speaking against Judaizers. So do you see how all this historical and cultural background that he's giving, in the textual background that he's given from Acts, is a distraction from what the context of Galatians is? The context of Galatians doesn't have anything to do with paganism. It has to do with the old covenant being pushed as necessary for righteousness and or salvation. In Galatians 3, Paul said, did you receive the Spirit by observing the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? Paganism and Gnosticism is not anywhere in the mix here of what the problem is. The problem is the old covenant being pushed and an abandoning of the Spirit for the human effort of observing the old covenant. So that immediately struck me when I was reading this, as I said, who does Paul say he's speaking against? It's not who this dude says Paul is speaking against. So that's the first problem with this section of the text that I'm reading. Okay? The next problem I'm going to read further so that you can understand better when I point this out. Okay? He says, further, the major thrust of the Galatian epistle is to put them back on track because someone had been teaching a different gospel, a perversion of the gospel of Christ. The Galatians had derailed on their understanding of how sinners are justified. Now, based on what I just told you, from Galatians. Chapters 2, chapters 3. Matter of fact, if you pick up Galatians right now and you start reading it, I want to ask you, how hard is it for you to tell that this is what Galatians is about? That Paul is trying to put some folks back on track because someone had been teaching a different gospel. That's simple to pick up. Why is he telling you this as if it's something difficult for you? Like you need him to tell you that this is what Galatians is about. Why is he doing that? Because this is not hard to understand. I'm going to tell you because it's very important to what's about to go down in the other verses. This is another thing false teachers do, is that they tell you simple things in the text that you can pick up yourself, because they don't want you to be able to logically read the text and see what it's talking about. They want you to rely on them to interpret the text for you. Hebrews says you should be teachers by now. The purpose of the gift of teaching is for the one who is teaching you to bring you to the point where you can be a teacher. So when you read my account, the reason why I don't teach like this is another thing that he's doing that I don't teach like, because my goal is to get you to be able to understand the Bible for yourself, to go in and read for yourself. Because as the wisdom theology of Proverbs is, the goal is to gain the wisdom of Yahweh and to have discernment. As Ecclesiastes says, the man who fears Yahweh avoids every extreme. You don't avoid every extreme by just parroting what you heard somebody say. You got to have discernment to do that. And discernment is what we currently call logic. So any teacher that is led by the Spirit is going to be teaching so that you come into understanding of the truth, and therefore you gain the ability to do logic so that you can discern things on your own. We don't teach like this. This teaching style is done by folks who want you to discard your ability to understand the text, even simple things like this, so that you believe that you need them to tell you simple things like this. And if you start believing that you need them to tell you simple things like this, then you will not be able to see the simple things in the text that disprove what they're telling you about the text in other places. And you're about to immediately get an example of this, okay? So he says the Galatians had derailed on their understanding of how sinners are justified. To be justified means to have one's sins forgiven and to be brought into a right relationship with God. False teachers in Galatia taught that one was justified by doing physical works of some kind. You see what he just told you? False teachers in Galatia taught that one was justified by doing physical works of some kind. And now he's telling you that observance of the holidays is necessary. He's doing the same thing as the false teachers in Galatia. But you can't see it because you need him to tell you the simple things. That Galatia is about putting somebody back on track. You've already bought into the idea that you need him to tell you the simple things. You already push logic to the side. So when he tells you to be justified, when he says false teachers in Galatia taught that one was justified by doing physical works of some kind, you're not crediting his teaching as You know what I'm saying? You're justified by doing physical works of some kind. There's a necessity to physical works. You're not connecting the dots. Because you're giving yourself over to be led by him into his position, not to logically break down what he's saying. And so when he tells on himself here, you don't recognize it. Now he gives further example of this when he says, in dealing with this matter, Paul felt an urgency to emphasize that we are justified by faith in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We who are Jews by nature are not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ, or in Christ Yeshua. I don't say Jesus. Even we have believed in Christ Yeshua, that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. For by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. He's showing you this plain as day, and at the same time teaching that the law has to be observed. How does those two go together? He says one of the works of the law that the false teachers insisted was necessary for justification was obviously circumcision. Still telling the truth, but it was not just the old covenant regulations that were being enjoined upon the Galatians, because Paul says the false teachers themselves did not keep the law. He quotes Galatians 6:13 here. Evidently, the false teachings produced a licentious lifestyle. He quotes Galatians 5:13-21. This is where, after telling the truth, he now tells a lie. He combines two parts of Galatians that have nothing to do with each other in order to get this narrative that the folks who were teaching these things. Now, let me just continue with that point. He's combining these two parts of Galatians to say that those who were teaching these things weren't just teaching the old covenant, living by the old covenant. They were also teaching licentiousness. Or they could not have been teaching the old covenant because whatever was being taught produced licentiousness. Here's a question, okay? What does teaching the old covenant, how do I phrase this? Haven't we all seen folks who are legalists, but their legalism has no ability to do anything to remedy sin? We've all seen that, right? Folks who come and they preach legalism, and they're still abusers, exploiters in every way. Whether that's fornication, drug addiction, whatever the case might be. Haven't we seen that? So if the teachings produce licentiousness, how does that disprove that the teachings are to observe the old covenant? That logic does not even follow, because we see it disproved in everyday life. Observance of the old covenant does not prevent anybody from sinning. It doesn't prevent anybody from being licentious. In fact, a point that Paul makes over and over again is that the law is not sufficient to prevent sin. And that's important for understanding this Galatians 6:13, because Galatians 6:13 is not the only place where Paul says that those who are teaching you to follow the law don't follow it themselves. In fact, when he is speaking against Peter, he said, Peter, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile. So Peter, despite teaching the law, was not following the law. Does that mean that Peter was licentious? That don't have nothing to do with what Paul's talking about. Whenever he uses this argument, what he's talking about is the hypocrisy or the play acting. It's that comes with the self-righteousness of human effort. And in that, he's pointing out the inability of the law to produce righteousness. The point is that these folks who follow the law are not growing in righteousness. They're talking about the law, but they don't have the ability to fulfill it. Which Paul tells us that the point of the law, he says this in Romans, that the point of the law was to show us, it's a mirror. It shows us our condition. We were never supposed to fulfill the law. We were never supposed to achieve the law, because it was never possible. Not by our own human effort. It was never possible. That's the basis of this Galatians 6:13, wherever Paul uses it. Furthermore, when you look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 21, you see that when Paul talks about avoiding licentiousness, this section of the text is couched within what he's preaching from the end of chapter 4 going into the rest of chapter 5, where he makes this point that Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. Therefore, brothers, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Okay? So, he's teaching grace here. And just like in Romans, he gets to a point where he says that grace is not the same thing as hyper grace. When he says, do not use your freedom to indulge in the sinful nature, he's continuing the teaching about grace. Even though you are free, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. This is similar to in 1 Corinthians, where he says something like, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. He says something like, everything is available for me to do, but I will not be slave to anything. Peter in one of his epistles says, whatever has a man is slave to whatever has mastered him. So there's this ethic in the New Testament that even though do not be slave to anything other than Yeshua. And so even though you're free, you're not free to be slave to the sin nature, which is what hypergrace is about. So that's the point of Paul teaching about licentiousness. Teaching against licentiousness. He's not teaching against what the circumcision group is teaching. He's teaching against how his teaching can be misinterpreted. He's not teaching against what somebody else is teaching. He's clarifying about what he is teaching. So do you see how, okay, now this is my question. How do you combine this with Galatians 6:13 when Galatians 6:13 is preaching against what somebody else is preaching? Galatians 5:13 through 21 is him clarifying what he is teaching. Galatians 6:13 is him teaching against what somebody else is teaching. How do you combine these two things together to make them say one thing when they're talking about different things? Do you see how false teachers have the ability to counterfeit context? They layer these isolated readings on top of each other, and it looks like they're being systemic. It looks like it's line upon line, precept upon precept. But it has nothing to do with what the text is actually talking about. Can you see that now? Because it's gonna get more elaborate than this. The way that this guy interprets these verses. But my point that I'm trying to make here is that the way that a lot of false teachers teach is that they counterfeit sophistication to make it look like those who they're speaking against are unsophisticated in their reading. So they're not proving their position. A linchpin to their ability to get you to believe their position is this portrayal of their position as sophisticated and the opposing position as unsophisticated. So it looks like they're being systematic when they're really reading things in isolation and then just putting them on top of one another. What I just showed you is sophisticated. That's systematic. That's the context. What this dude is doing is a counterfeit. So let's get into it. Let's go further so that you can see this. Okay? More so you can see it playing out as he makes it more and more elaborate. He says the preponderance of evidence indicates that the false teachers were teaching a blend of Judaism and Gnosticism. The preponderance of what evidence? This is not what the text is saying. As I just showed you, if you ask the question, who was Paul speaking against? There's no pagans, there's no Gnostics. Okay? So this preponderance of evidence that he's talking about is his narrative. It is not the text. So the preponderance of evidence indicates that the false teachers were teaching a blend of Judaism and Gnosticism. The philosophy of Gnosticism taught that everything physical was evil and that people could attain a higher spiritual understanding through effort. It was the type of philosophy that its adherents thought could be used to enhance or improve anyone's religion. In Paul's letter to the Colossians, we read of this same philosophy having an influence there. It was characterized by strict legalism, a taste not touch attitude, neglect of the body, worship of angels, and a false humility. You see what he just did there? If you didn't, let me ask you some questions so you can see what he just did there. He said it was characterized by strict legalism, a taste not touch attitude, neglect of the body, worship of angels, and a false humility. Here go my questions. Okay. Is strict legalism unique to Gnosticism, or does that also appear in Old Covenant observance? Taste not, touch not attitude. Is that strictly Gnostic, or does that also appear in Old Covenant observance? Neglect of the body, is that uniquely Gnostic, or does it also appear in Old Covenant observance? Was it present in the Pharisaical traditions that Yeshua was preaching against? Worship of angels. Now that's not in the Old Covenant, but is that uniquely Gnostic? Or was that also present in the Jewish traditions of the time? And a false humility. Is that unique to Gnosticism, or does that also appear with folks who preach the Old Covenant? Why is this dude trying to make it seem like these things are unique to Gnosticism? You find all of these things in the Old Covenant and or in the Jewish traditions of the time. Now, worship of angels, okay? That wasn't called worship of angels, but it was like veneration of the saints. The Catholics and the Orthodox till this day still have deuterocanonical books from the Old Testament that they use to support certain beliefs. And what we would now consider to be ancestor worship appears in some form or fashion in those books. There are some other practices that also they use those books to say, you know, this is what the Jews were doing, and so it was things that Yeshua and the apostles were doing and that they passed on to the churches throughout history. And you don't know it because Protestants took these books out of the Bible. So we call these practices worship, but they would have been called back then, you know, something like, you know, veneration or whatever, honoring or something. Taste not, touch not. This is clean, this is unclean. Eat this, you can't eat that. That's what neglect of the body. That's these crazy standards about modesty. Even Paul taught some of this kind of stuff. Because again, the apostles were themselves even stuck in a lot of this Jewish culturalism. So you see Paul talking about the headdress, for example. No matter how hot it is outside, females got to walk around with a thing on their head that, you know what I'm saying, is like the what you call it in Islam, put the thing over the face. In the black veil, don't matter how hot it is outside, you got to go out and wear that. But dressing for the weather is not a thing. You got always, you know what I'm saying? Well, that's an example of something that's hard on the body. Always at every moment going, I can't look at the body of anybody of the opposite sex because I'm going to be sinning if I do that. And so you're constantly beating yourself up all the time to never watch this and to never look at that and to never. But the man who loves Yahweh will avoid every extreme. When you're stuck in an extreme, you're what are you doing? You're beating yourself up over something that's, oh well, I can't. That's hard on the body. All of this stuff is present in Old Covenant observance. Why is he pretending like it's unique to Gnosticism? Well, he has to pretend like it's unique to Gnosticism. Because if it's also present in Old Covenant observance, you know, strict legalism, if all this stuff is also present in Old Covenant observance, then Paul can also be talking about the Old Covenant. So what he's doing is narrowing the options down by pretending like these things don't apply to more than one thing, so that you only go for this one option. This is how these folks look like they're contextual and they're not. It's all about manipulating your perception into a particular conclusion. It's not about teaching you to be able to understand what the text is saying. So let's keep going. He says, contrary to Gnosticism, Paul tells the Galatians that they should not listen to even an angel from heaven who taught a false gospel. Stop. Here's another example. Okay. Is this unique to Gnosticism? No, it's not. Because if somebody that's following the Old Covenant believes that an angel that comes from God is going to, that teaches you how to be, that to tell you how to be righteous, will be sent by Yahweh to teach you to observe the Old Covenant, then that means somebody who follows the Old Covenant believes that an angel that comes from heaven and gives you a false gospel should be listened to. So it's not uniquely Gnostic to say that you should believe an angel that teaches you a false gospel. Everybody that believes a false gospel believes that if an angel comes to them, the angel is going to teach what they believe. Or if an angel goes to somebody else to teach them about righteousness, the angel is going to teach what they believe. So every false teacher believes this, including this dude. He believes that if an angel would come to you and tell you that you have to teach you about, let's say the topic here is the holidays, he believes that the angel would tell you that you have to follow the holidays. So he believes that you should listen to an angel that teaches you a false gospel. But he doesn't believe that his gospel is false. But no false teacher believes that their gospel is false. This is what the proving is for. But his stuff is resting on assumptions. He's not going through the logical proving process. He's assuming that this can only apply to Gnosticism. There's no way that this could apply to the Old Covenant, circumcision group that Paul is speaking against. And this was because he isn't even listening to who Paul said he's speaking against. He's presuming that Paul is speaking against paganism and Gnosticism. So do you see what I'm talking about? Okay? He's not reading the text to you. He's reading his biochemistry, his emotions. And the big reason why he had that whole section where he's telling you these simple things about the text that you should be able to, that you can, I'm going to say you can know that Galatians is teaching those things. That these folks were breaking away for a false gospel. Everybody can tell that. The reason why he's telling you this, like he's giving you some kind of context that you can't pick up on your own, is so that when you stop trusting yourself about those simple things and you start trusting him to tell you even those simple things, you become slave to his biochemistry and you start reading that biochemistry into the text. And then it expands from that simple point to all these other points that we're now talking about. That's how they backdoor into your mind, and then they expand it as they read more and more of the text. So he goes on to say, also, even though the Gnostics taught a strict discipline of the body, it could sometimes lead to a licentious lifestyle. The idea that the physical evil body was separate from the spirit often led to the attitude that what one did with the body made no difference. That's 100% true. But as I just said, we all have the experience of the strict legalism of the old covenant also producing licentiousness. So this is not something that's uniquely Gnostic. It also applies to the old covenant. Those who follow the law don't even succeed in keeping it themselves because they can't. That's where the licentiousness comes from, is that you're trying to do something wicked already. You don't have the ability to be righteous on your own. So the human effort of trying to follow the law is going to fail. And when it fails, what's going to happen? Your effort is going to get chipped away, chipped away, chipped away, chipped away. And that's how you get into licentiousness. And I don't know what he means by licentiousness, but a proper understanding of licentiousness includes slavery to the biochemistry in general. So even if you're walking around, for example, not following the law, but in your biochemistry, you're always getting worked up against judging other folks and feeling good bashing them over the head with the law. That also is falling under licentiousness. If you're heavy in shame, if you're heavy in self-exaltation over somebody else, because I'm following the law and they're not, when according to Paul, in your own experiences, you know that you don't succeed in keeping the law, that you're telling other folks to follow, that hypocrisy is licentiousness. The shame is licentiousness. The abuse of the self-exaltation that goes into the shame is licentiousness. Okay? We all have experience with this. So we know that this is not unique to Gnosticism. But once you're deceived into depending on him and doing away with your ability to do logic, it doesn't matter what you know about the old covenant observance. You lose the ability to logically understand and know that these things also apply to the old covenant. So now he goes into into explaining what are these elements of the world. he says, what then were the days, months, seasons, and years that Paul criticizes the Galatians for observing? He says, and this is a very important tactic to note here, Paul nowhere in the entire letter mentions God's holidays. This is something that I call wooden interpretation. And that's a scholarly term for when amateurs in the field of linguistics try to do scholarship by talking about the meanings of ancient words. And they interpret the word according to its base etymology, with no respect for how the meaning of the word developed over time, how it was used within the cultures, how it's being used within the context of the text that is written in. So this dude has no respect for the contents of the text. His wooden interpretation is to say that God's holy days are not mentioned by name, so there's no way that the text can be talking about them. But that's not how reading works. And that's not how writing works. Paul doesn't have to mention God's holy days by name if he's already been talking about the law the entire time. He's talking about going back to the law. So the context tells us that the holy days are the holy days that are in the law. It doesn't need to be explicitly stated unless you're stupid. And so this tactic of and you know, there's a good teachers who are trying to get you to learn how to discern, to have the spirit of Yahweh so that you have the ability to discern, which again is to do logic, right? They're not going to be worried about spoon feeding you everything. Somebody who's always plainly stating stuff is somebody who thinks that you're too stupid to get it. And that's not going to be a good teacher. There's going to be somebody that's trying to manipulate you into a position that you don't logically come to if you just read the text and apply logic as you read. So this is already a bad standard. But again, the purpose of this tactic is to manipulate your perception. Is to narrow things down to this little window and say this is the only way that you can view things. There are other options. This is not the only option, is that Paul has to name the holy days in order for him to be talking about the holy day. That's not the only option. There's also the option that he can be talking in context about the holy days, and so therefore he doesn't need to mention them by name. So he says, second, the apostle would never refer to holy days that God constituted as weak and beggarly elements. Now, I don't think that Paul is calling the holy days weak and beggarly elements here. I believe that he's referring to spirits. And this guy is going to get into that, so we're partially in agreement on that. But to say that he would never refer to them as weak and beggarly elements, when in Romans 14, He refers to it as weak faith to call certain days special and certain days not special. That's that's inconsistent. Why is it weak faith to say this is unclean and that's not, to say this is a special day and that's not? It's because there's no, your label of clean and unclean, holy and holy doesn't have any ability to do nothing. It has no ability to do anything about sin. It has no ability to do anything about righteousness. That comes from Yahweh. What follows from that is that your labels are weak and beggarly. So that's inconsistent with his claim. If his weak faith to practice holidays, that means the holidays are weak and beggarly. I agree, Paul is not calling the holidays weak and beggarly in Galatians. I'm just saying it does not follow from what that he would never call the holidays weak and beggarly, because it's weak faith to practice the holidays, according to Romans 14. And so that means that there is no ability, or what most folks would say, there is no power in those things. Okay? He says, besides, he taught the Corinthians to observe Passover in the days of unleavened bread, and he kept the Sabbath in holy days himself. If you go to that passage where he tells the Corinthians to observe the Passover, you'll notice very quickly, he's not telling them to do nothing with physical bread, with material objects, because he says, do away with the yeast of he says malice, and I think he says greed, maybe. I'm not totally sure. But there it's clear that he's not talking about observing the Passover via material things. He's talking about observing the Passover as an immaterial reality. Because if the yeast that you're doing away with is sin, then that means the bread, the unleavened bread that you're eating or whatever, is Yeshua. So this has nothing to do with Passover as it's practiced in the Old Covenant. This is all immaterial realities, observing the Passover by living Yeshua. And then there are verses where Paul talks about the Sabbath is Yeshua. And then Hebrews talks about that. And so in Paul's personal life, his observance of these holidays was living Yeshua. It was not sitting down doing some earthly, thing as described in the Old Covenant. Now, there may have been times where he did do that, because he tells us, he says, to the Romans, I become like a Roman. To one under the law, I become like one under the law. I make myself a slave to every man, even though I am slave to nobody. But I do have a master, and it is Christ. And he said, I do this so that I can bring as many folks to the gospel as possible. So there are times where if Paul was among the Jews, he would have celebrated these holidays according to how they were done in the Old Testament. And we see an example of this near the end of Acts, when James brings these 4 Gentiles to Peter and tells him to do a purification ritual for them so that they can enter the temple. entered the temple. And despite everything that Paul preached against these types of things, he does do the purification ritual. So this is not because this is something that he would have done as a personal thing. It's because of this ethic that he had of, if I go here where these folks live, then, you know, I live as that. And so while he was among the Gentiles, or when he was in his personal life, he would not have, he probably wouldn't even have been concerned. Well, in his personal life, he would have observed these holidays, like I said, according to the immaterial reality way that he talks about them. But amongst the Gentiles, he probably wouldn't have even, he probably wouldn't have bothered with them at all. So, and then when he was amongst those under the law, then he would have performed them as they were in the law. Okay? So you can't point to these verses where it talks about Paul observing holidays or something, and then assume that this means that he was following the old covenant. That's not context. But it does counterfeit context. Okay? So when the scriptures in question are put into context, the explanation of what these days were becomes clear. So everything that he's saying depends upon everything that he said before being correct. This is an example of what I mean by his teachings don't stand on their own. And that's critical of that's a critical component I find that occurs over and over again in false teaching. Is that his interpretation of Galatians does not stand simply on Galatians. It's all this stuff taken over here, over here, over there, over there, brought together, and there's nothing that he can give individually if he just had Galatians to support this position. Okay? In chapter 3, Paul shows the Galatians that salvation through faith in Christ is the fulfillment of the promise made. I'm trying to get down to the weak and beggarly elements to save time. I want to say what he says about the purpose. Where does he say it? He says that when Paul talks about Sarah and Hagar, he says Sarah is the Jews, represents the Jews, and Hagar represents the Gentiles. That's false. It seems pretty obvious that Sarah represents those who are born again. It does not represent the Jews, which means and he says explicitly that Hagar represents those who are under the old covenant. So I would say that Hagar has to do with anybody that's not born again, period. But specifically, Paul is using it to talk about the old covenant. So I don't know how he got the Jew is Sarah and the Gentile is Hagar. That was odd, but okay. He says the word elements is the Greek word what is it? Stoicheon, I guess, which means any first thing or principle. In bondage under the elements of the world refers to the fact that the unconverted mind is subject to the influence of Satan and his demons, the rulers of this world and the authors of all idolatrous worship. Okay, now I want to read Galatians 4. I want to read Galatians 4 to you to show you something. Okay, Galatians 4 verse 1, he says, "What I am saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. He is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his Father. So also when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. So when Paul wasn't born again and when he was under the old covenant, well, let me read this so that, so I'm not doing the same thing that this dude is doing. Let me just read it. So also when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights, full rights of sons. So before Paul was born again, he was subjected to the basic principles. How was he freed from the basic principles? Well, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law. Do you see how Paul is saying that the basic elements were behind the law? This is important to note because later in Galatians chapter 4, verse 8, he says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods." And he's talking about the pagan gods here. This is the only place that can be misinterpreted to be referring to pagan gods. And this is what this dude is hinging lynching or hinging his view on. He says, "But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable principles, or weak and beggarly elements? Do you wish to be enslaved to them all over again?" Okay. Now, remember what these folks have turned to is the law. So the same law that Paul says earlier in chapter 4 is administrated by the basic elements or the rudimentary elements. He's saying here that then this is the law that Paul followed. You see, when we were children, I was a child, I did childish things, that I grew up, I put childish things behind me. Everything I was before I considered to be rubbish. A Jew of Jews, a student of Gamaliel, Benjamite. I consider all that to be rubbish. That's the old covenant. It's rubbish. Why is it rubbish? We're starting to see some of this. This is the real context. Because these weak and beggarly elements were administrating the law. Okay? Now, as he says, this does refer to Satan and his demons, but let me show you something. Go to Acts and look at Stephen when he's being martyred and he's going through the history of Israel. I believe it's Stephen who says this. He says the law was put into effect by angels. See? So we see that Stephen also had the view that there were spirits who were administrating the law. But these were not wicked spirits. These were the righteous spirits that we call angels. So when Paul talks about the weak and beggarly elements behind the law, he's not talking about Satan and his demons. He's talking about the same thing Stephen's talking about. The angels were the administrators of the law. So these folks turning back to this system, that's the weak and beggarly elements, this is not a system that was exclusively administrated by Satan and his demons. This is supported by the book of Daniel, where you see that there are these spirits that Yahweh has set up to have jurisdictions over nations and tribes and stuff like this. And there are wicked ones and there are righteous ones. So this is why Paul can reference the pagan gods, even though he's talking about the law. Even though he's talking about the spirits that administrate the law and not the pagan gods who are against the law, he can put them both under one grouping as the weak and beggarly elements. And this is where some of the teaching of Michael Heiser is useful. Because once we fell, we were created in the image of Yahweh, and that's a royalty term. Adam was created as a priest king, representing Yahweh, his co-regent, his queen, let's say. He was Yahweh's divine counsel. He falls, and then the spirits are placed above him. So Paul says, they were guardians and trustees over us until the time that Yeshua comes into the world. We're born again, and then we rise up to the place where we own the whole estate. And Paul says, do you not know in I think 1 Corinthians that we will rule over the angels? See, both the righteous spirits and the wicked spirits who were part of this system were called Elohim in the Old Testament. Because they become Yahweh's divine counsel as a substitute for us due to our diminutive fall beneath them when Satan steals our kingship. So the spirits take our position. This is why Paul can lump them all under the same category as the weak and beggarly elements. It's not because these people went to paganism. It's because when they went back to the law, they went back to the system of being beneath the spirits, particularly the spirits who were tasked with administrating the law. I'm not sure if those are still righteous spirits, because righteous spirits today would be pointing you to Yeshua and not the law. So to that degree, I suppose you can say that they turned to paganism, because the old covenant might be paganism today, but I don't really know if that's what Paul is saying. So he says Satan and his demons are the origin, the underlying cause of all of the evil ways of this world. That's not true. It's the sin nature, and all unconverted humans are under their sway. That's partially true. They're not just under the sway of the Satan. They're under the sway of all of the spirits that were tasked, as you see in Daniel, to have jurisdiction over all these different locations. And you even have the hail representing the 4 sections of the sky and probably the 4 sections of the earth. Then you have the Ophanim, who are the wheels. Well, I don't want to get into that, but you see there's this hierarchy of jurisdiction that the spirits have over our land of the living. This is because when we fell, they became our substitute. The Satan stole our kingship. So we're underneath them now, both the righteous spirits and the wicked ones. Okay? So the unconverted human is not just under the Satan. They're under the spirits, period. And a big point of Paul's message is that it's time for you to grow up and graduate from this. You're supposed to be above the spirits. And so Yeshua has come for you to be born again so you can grow up into your inheritance as one made in the image of Yahweh, as one made in Yeshua, because Yeshua is the express image. So he is the image of Yahweh. Yeshua comes, incarnates, Yabases himself, then he crucified, glorified in the ascension. And the ascension is to complete the sacrificial ritual. I don't want to get into that, but look into the sprinkling of the blood on the mercy seat. Okay? And once that's completed, Yeshua, the perfect representation of himself, is the first fully grown human being set to inherit the earth. When you're born again through him as his sons, you share in that inheritance. A big part of Paul's message is graduate into that and stop being beneath the spirits. That's what Paul is talking about here. Okay. Now he says, he quotes Romans 8:7, because the carnal mind is at enmity against God. Uh, do do do. Do do. Yeah, he doesn't say anything new after this. Everything after this is sort of like a repetition of what he's already said, and I would be saying the same things over and over again if I kept reading. So this is the complete reading of the article. Okay. There's one last thing that I want to say, and this is from and make sure you read Galatians yourself so that you know that I'm not lying. And so I want to talk about Galatians 4, this part where Paul allegorizes Sarah and Hagar. Notice what he says. He says, one covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. So this is a big thing that I want to say here. Okay. The only reason I'm preaching against observing the law is for those who are born again. I only talk for those who want to know the truth. Okay? For you who are born again, you are born of the second woman who is free. Therefore, brothers, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. So I'm preaching against old covenant observance for you who are born again, so that you do not view yourself as a slave. See, but for those who want to follow the law, who are not born again, they're telling the truth about themselves. They are slaves. Okay? If you read Isaiah, one of the things that Isaiah says, and it's underrated, is that in the new creation, the Israelites, the Gentiles, will serve the Israelites as slaves. Israel is all of those who are born again. Paul makes this point over and over and over again. So that means that the Gentiles who will serve Israel is a particular group of folks who are not born again, but by some mechanism they make it into the new creation. And I believe that's the Old Testament model of the messiahs, of how messiahs are created. Okay? That being said, I do not want anybody to be going too hard against those who are not born again who want to follow the law. Because part of messianic prophecy is in the new creation, there are going to be these two groups. Those is going to be Israel, is going to be Gentiles. The other is going to serve the one. So anybody that's following the old covenant, they're telling the truth about themselves. And this is the height of righteousness for them in their human effort. I have a post about this on my account if you want to read it. A possible salvation mechanism for those who aren't born again. And I get into a verse where Yeshua talks about how I can't explain it, but I'll put it in the caption when I make this live into when I share this live and save it. I'll put that verse in the caption because I don't want to misquote it. But when you read the verse, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's this overlooked thing in the Bible where there's some kind of salvation mechanism for those who aren't born again. And Old Testament Messianic prophecy tells us that this group has to exist because there's going to be two groups, Israel, Gentiles. The other is going to serve the one. So I don't want anybody to be going too hard against anybody who says that they're a slave because they're telling the truth about themselves. Yeshua said, he said something like, nobody who calls on my name can at the same time speak bad about me. It's this point that he was making that they belong to me regardless. And it's a strange verse, but it's important to understand what's being taught. Okay? So that you're not going around over condemning anybody. The relevance of preaching against the old covenant observance is for we who are born again to not fall into the deception that we are slaves. We are not. Do you not know that we will rule over even the angels? And this might even be the basis of Paul and what he teaches in Romans 14. He may have had the same view that I'm telling you right now. Or maybe he didn't fully understand it. But I believe that this is probably working behind some of his teachings, such as Romans 14. And so I don't want anybody to listen to this and then go and be overzealous against the old covenant observance. I just want you to understand, as someone who is born again, you are not a slave. But the slaves are slaves, and the way that they are living, what business is it of mine to judge somebody that's outside the church? You see? So, it's when these things are being taught as necessary for righteousness and salvation, that's when it's important to preach against them. That's when it's important to come against them. Okay? And even then, within the understanding that the slave is telling the truth about what they are. That the benefit of preaching against these things is so that the born again person does not view themselves as a slave. I hope that makes sense.